I have the pleasure of providing some opening remarks for this session. As I mentioned, my name is Patimo Raman. I'm a program lead at South North for the Operationalizing Just Transitions in Africa program. So the concept of just transition, as introduced in the Paris Agreement, aims to safeguard jobs and socioeconomic rights as economies transition from fossil fuel to renewable energy. However, Africa faces a significant evidence gap in operationalizing the just transition agenda in terms of both policy and action. Adopting just transition pathways and making financial flows consistent with these pathways will benefit Africa by reducing vulnerabilities of marginalized groups and increasing the continent's access to investment flows tied to global low emissions and climate resilient infrastructure development. What we've been interested in terms of the OJTA program is in exploring the just transition considerations, what these are and how they've been integrated, for example, even at the local level. As we all know, and we're acutely aware of the pressing need for effective strategies to bolster resilience and adaptation in the global south. These regions are really on the front line of climate change and are facing increasingly severe weather events, rising sea levels and other environmental challenges that really threaten their developmental goals and really their livelihoods. So these challenges are not only disrupting lives, but also threatening the attainment of crucial developmental goals. In today's discussion, which we find is very important because it focuses on the intersection of innovative financial mechanisms and enhancing resilience within the context of this need for a just transition. So our aim is to explore how these financial innovations can be harnessed to not only enhance climate resilience, but also to ensure that the transition is equitable and inclusive. The concept of just transition, as we know, emphasizes that as we strive to build climate resilience, we must also ensure that the transition does not disproportionately impact vulnerable communities and workers. So it's really about creating a sustainable future where everyone has a stake and no one is left behind. Within the global south, where economic disparities and social inequalities are prevalent, this approach is particularly significant, and it offers a pathway to not only address environmental challenges, but also to foster social and economic inclusion. A critical approach for financing resilience in the global south involves being both proactive rather than reactive. So this includes exploring ways to enhance and diversify the flows of financial resources. For instance, how can insurance be leveraged to create an environment that encourages greater private sector investment? And also, while substantial funds are being directed towards just transitions and climate finance from various sources, we must also consider how to strategically mobilize and link these financial flows, particularly as global financial targets remain largely unmet, and new goals such as the NCQG and loss and damage fund come to play. So how can we think of or rethink finance in a more integrated and cohesive manner? And how can Africa lead the way in connecting and synergizing different financial sources to support resilience and sustainable development? We have the privilege of hearing insights from our lovely panelists who are leading experts and practitioners and who are working at the forefront of financing climate action and at various levels and in their respective fields and sectors. So it's through dialogues such as these that we continue to shed light on practical solutions and actionable strategies that can drive meaningful progress in the global south. What we really need is collective effort to develop solutions that are not only innovative, but also grounded in the realities of those who are most affected by climate change. So thank you very much for being here. I'm looking forward to the discussion. And with that, I hand over to our moderator for the day, Mr. Emil Harikishan, who's the CDK and finance lead. Over to you, Emil. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Patsimo, and hello, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here, I think, not only because this is such a crucial conversation to my continent, but such a crucial conversation in the drumbeat up to COP29 in Baku, Azerbaijan. And we're joined here today, as Patsimo has said, with an incredible group of individuals who will bring a diversity of different perspectives on this topic and really help us unpack and understand in a dynamic and critical way the importance of this conversation, not just to the African continent. And of course, we're convening this as the lead, South-South-North, as the co-lead rather, along with Slum Dwellers International of the Africa Regional Resilience Hub, and of course, emphasizing the importance of this conversation to our continent, but also emphasizing the conversation and just transitions in all its nuance globally as well, and more broadly across the global South, or the majority world, as some people prefer to call it. So I will very briefly walk through the individuals we have with us here today on our panel, but I turn over to them to then introduce themselves in more detail. One of our panelists, Constance Okolet, who's joining us from rural Uganda, seems to be having some connectivity issues. So we certainly hope that Constance will be able to join us as they really bring in a critical voice of the most climate-affected communities in rural Uganda in this case, but really speaking to the importance of this conversation to those who are on the ground and are facing some of the worst impacts of climate change we very much need to be supporting and putting at the forefront of a shared vision of prosperity and climate action. So let's jump into the panel discussion. We really hope for it to be quite conversational. Again, as I mentioned, we've brought here today a diversity of different voices from industry, from think tanks, from government or implementing entities, as well as Constance from a grassroots network as well to speak on this. But without further ado, let me just walk through the individuals quite briefly, and then I'll hand over to them for a minute or two to speak about themselves. So we have Luanle Mkadi, a principal specialist from the Industrial Development Corporation, or IDC, from South Africa, who is also a responsible investments and sustainability specialist. We have Bisani Baloyi, a program co-director from the Institute for Economic Justice, as well as a co-author of a really valuable toolkit called Advocating for Rights-Based Climate Investment Plans in Developing Nations to Realize a Just Transition. We have Pauline Makutsa from the Adaptation Consortium from Kenya, who is a climate finance and governance expert, and Pauline can really speak to Kenya's approach to its devolved climate finance architecture and how it's really trying to get finance to where it matters at the local level and empowering communities to make decisions and be architects of change in their own life. And I've mentioned Constance Okolet already, who's the chairperson of the Osakuru United Women's Network in Uganda, a 2,000 plus strong women's network focusing on women's issues, but specifically really putting a fine point on the differentiated impacts of climate change on women and girls, and how we can best support women and girls in taking action where they are based, and again, being architects of change in their own lives. So let me turn over to our speakers to let them introduce themselves with a bit more detail. So Luanle, let me hand over to you for a minute or two on IDC and yourself.
Good morning to everyone. As Emil has said, my name is Luanle Mkadi. I work for a development finance institution called the Industrial Development Corporation out of Johannesburg. We service the South African market and the African market at large. Our mandate is strictly on sustainable industrial development. We are there to actually transform and transition the economy. So the just transition is at the core of what we've been doing for the last 40, 50 years or so. And the context of where the economy is or has been has always defined how we approach sustainable industrial development. When we started out, the economy, the South African economy that is, was going through a certain period. And during that time, we were able to startup, industries which were required at that point in time. In today's context, where the world is actually trying to evaluate itself from a climate change perspective, and where they're trying in an economy like South Africa and various economies in the region, where they're trying to actually redefine what a just transition means for them, we've been focusing on how do we bring entrepreneurs, how do we establish entrepreneurs in this space, and also how do we partner with our business partners in basically developing a pipeline which will respond to the just transition requirement. I work at the IDC as a sustainability specialist, so I work with various teams who are focusing on policy, strategy, investment strategies that we develop, the internal industry plans that are aligned to the master plans that the Department of Trade and Industry and Competition has put in place. I work with strategic business units who are basically client-facing, who actually go and handhold clients and our business partners in developing transactions or initiatives that are contributing to the just transition. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much, Luanle. Basani, over to you.
Hi, briefly, thank you so much for the introduction. So I am at the Institute for Economic Justice, which is a think tank, an advocacy think tank, I could say, based in Johannesburg. And basically our vision is for, and I could say our mission is to ensure that we have the equitable distribution of resources and economic decision-making in a manner that ensures, the advancement of rights realization, both for humans and also for the planet. So that is at the core of what we try to do. Now, we do that in terms of how our approach to doing that is through what we call the RAP, which is research, advocacy, and policy, where we undertake research in ways that are collaborative with, social forces, some within the state as well. We undertake research that's quite collaborative, that basically helps in guiding the advocacy of these social forces, right? We also do some advocacy in and of ourselves. We work at a regional basis, so we're not only focused on South Africa. So some of our projects are across the continent, working with other partners in the region, and also we take quite a feminist analysis in the work that we do. We work across 6 projects, right, to meet key objectives. The one is on advancing progressive macroeconomic frameworks and development frameworks, and we work within 2 projects for that, which is resourcing rights realization, and also we work on the universal basic income grant. In terms of mobilizing resources for rights realization, climate finance is a very key part of that, and this is basically what has brought me in to this discussion. It's the work that we've done on climate finance. We also work on ensuring, worker livelihoods and sustainable livelihoods, right? And we have 2 projects within that, which are around the localization of renewable energy value chains, both in South Africa, Ghana, and Kenya. And that's a research and advocacy for that, for decent work and gender equity. And then there's another that looks at food systems. And then we have a capacity building project that tries to build capacities in neglected, pushed out frames of thinking within the economics discipline, right? That's feminist political economy, and then also heterodox economics more broadly, which are quite critical of mainstream economics, and we think those are very vital within for developing countries in particular. So yes, that's about me and us in a nutshell.
Thanks so much, Basani, and really looking forward to getting your perspective throughout this panel discussion from the Institute for Economic Justice. Pauline, over to you.
Good morning or good afternoon. It's my pleasure to be here today. My name is Pauline Makutsa. I work for the Adaptation Consortium in Nairobi. We work on devolving climate finance to sub-national and community level through a mechanism that we conceptualized and piloted, and it is now being implemented nationwide, that is called the County Climate Change Fund Mechanism. And if I can just give a brief overview of the mechanism, just so that we can have an idea of what we're talking about. So the mechanism is a legal and institutional framework that enables climate resources to be devolved, decentralized to subnational governments and to communities. It requires that subnational governments, we call them counties here in Kenya, establish a fund, a legal fund, through which the resources would come in, not just from their own resources, their own revenue, but also from national government and from other stakeholders, for example, from international climate funding resources and from the private sector. Then the mechanism also has an institutional framework that enables, that gives opportunity for communities to determine and make decisions with regards to how these resources will be used. The community institution is constitutes of a very broad representation, so that there is inclusivity. That means the youth, the women, the men, different kinds of livelihood stakeholders, private sector, civil society, religious institutions, each depending on what the county has, what the kind of personalities in the county. These are then elected into these decision-making bodies. They are called climate change planning committees. And then at the county level, we have the technical officers that support these committees in terms of giving them technical advice with regards to the climate investments that they are proposing that the resources would be used. Then the third component of this mechanism is participatory climate risk assessment tools. These are the resilience planning tools that the community use to assess their climate risks, their climate hazard potential, and therefore to be able to analyze and using some kind of framework determine where resources should go so that they address the most vulnerable area in terms of geographical region, the most vulnerable communities, so that there is a particular way in which climate decisions are made in that community. Also in this component is very important, there's the need for receiving climate information so that the project decisions that are made are based on climate predictions from the Kenya Meteorological Department, so that they can guide the kind of the decisions where the investments would be made. But also it is there is integration of indigenous knowledge in terms of determining the climate information required for this. Then the final component of this mechanism is the monitoring and evaluation. This is very important because it helps to measure whether the resources that are being put into climate actions are actually meeting adaptation needs of the community, whether they are in line with the development agenda of the county governments, and whether combined across the country, the different wards in the country, it is supporting Kenya reach her climate obligations at the international arena. So we at ADA Consortium, we piloted this mechanism in 5 counties between 2013 and 2018. And from 2019, this mechanism has been now rolled out to the rest of the country. And currently, it is being implemented through the National Treasury with some facility from the World Bank. Currently, about 150 million USD has been committed to this framework. And on top of that, each county government puts in some of their own resources. It's this year, currently this financial year, up to 23 million USD has been put into this project so that climate resilience and climate adaptation projects can be put in place throughout the wards at the community level. Thank you. I think I'll stop there.
Great. Thanks so much, Pauline. And of course, we will be sharing a little bit more about Kenya's approach to this as well. Constance hasn't been able to join us, and we were going to kick off this discussion by giving Constance an opportunity to speak about their story and specifically the Osakuru United Women's Network. But in lieu of Constance not being here, I still want to actually mention Constance's story. Hopefully they are still able to patch in, and we'll give them the floor if they are able to speak to that. But the regional resilience hubs under the Resilience Hub have always played this crucial role in meaningfully and authentically trying to amplify the voices of lesser heard constituencies or underrepresented constituencies, and specifically that of local communities. And that's why we felt starting off giving Constance an opportunity to speak about their story was really important in framing this panel discussion. But I will do a less than ideal job of at least mentioning Constance's story, and if they're able to join, we can hear from them directly. And I can also share a link to where we co-wrote Constance's story as well, so that those of you listening in can still go and read that story more in Constance's words. But Constance, many years ago, had started off as a village health officer in rural Uganda, trying to understand what was driving HIV and AIDS infection rates in those communities. And specifically for women, over the course of their work, had found that during times of particularly severe drought, the socioeconomic impacts and the differentiated impacts on women and girls led to increases in gender-based violence and domestic violence, as well as an increased push into sex work. And seeing that link between climate impacts and the work that Constance was doing many years ago, unpacking and understanding HIV and AIDS within these communities, really started to solidify this link between climate and the differentiated impacts that were being experienced by women and girls. And I think puts a really fine point on the intersecting and cascading impacts of climate and why we need to adopt a more holistic view in how we not only understand those impacts, but then also understand how to take action to address them in a way that is empowering and speaks to the priorities of particularly those in the most climate affected communities, but also in marginalized communities, etc. So that in a very small nutshell was part of Constance's story. And of course, Constance tells it far more eloquently and powerfully than I ever could. But we really wanted to start off with that to set the tone for discussion that by and large is still based in unpacking and understanding climate justice as well. So if Constance joined us, we will of course give them an opportunity to tell you that story themselves, and we can share the write-up of that story so that you may still read it in Constance's words. But let us continue. And Pauline, it was great to hear your brief introductory remarks about Kenya's approach to the County Climate Change Funds. Of course, locally led adaptation principles, which many on this call may be familiar with, has been something that has emerged in recent years and has been widely adopted, and in something that is gaining well-deserved traction and attention, particularly in terms of how we finance locally led adaptation. I'm not going to unpack the locally led adaptation principles in too much detail, but Pauline, rather give you an opportunity to talk to how Kenya has adopted, or rather is implementing, these locally led adaptation principles with the county climate change funds, and how you see the alignment with what are referred to as the just transition principles. So Pauline, over to you.
Okay, thank you. Kenya's County Climate Change Fund mechanism is actually based on the locally led adaptation principles. And this is seen in how the entire mechanism is structured. For example, the decision of what adaptation investments need to be made is done by the communities. And by this, not just the committees that have been been elected to come and represent the community, but they are actually supposed to go around in the villages, getting the opinion of everyone, then sitting together and considering and using the participatory resilience tools and the skills that they have gained, determine where these resources should go to which climate, to address which climate action. And then if you look at how the community committees, the decision-making organ at the community level is designed, it is intended to reduce structural inequalities, which is one of the principles of locally led adaptation. Therefore, you will find that there must be representation from diverse members of society, including persons with disabilities, the youth, the elderly, the men, different livelihood options. For example, if they are farmers and fisher folk, they must be represented in the committee, including religious leaders, civil society organizations based at the local level, and etc. So the aim is to ensure that everybody not only has a seat on the table, but their voice is heard in turn, because climate affects each category of society differently. Then the idea of having a fund that sits with the county government that is funded a percentage of the county's own revenue is to ensure that at the worst case scenario, there's a consistent and patient funding that is available to the communities every year. So the counties are supposed to put 2 to 3% of their budget every year into this fund, whether or not they receive funding from outside sources. So to provide consistent funding, that helps with the planning for communities, and also reduces the pressure to have, or the political pressure to have projects going only to certain areas, because we know that can be sure that we expect resources every year. And then the mechanism is designed in such a manner to promote transparency and accountability in terms of how is the money used, who is using it, and how are the projects then managed after they are put in place, because they're meant to be managed by the community and not by the government. Therefore, there's that sense of ownership, sense of commitment to the project, and that is the only way to build the resilience of the community. A lot of effort is put into building the capacities of the communities and the county government staff, because climate change in itself is a very complicated science. It affects all sectors of society differently. It affects people differently from one year to another. And therefore, a lot of effort needs to be made in building the internal capacity of communities, so to manage the resources and build actions or projects that will build their resilience. However, the local knowledge, indigenous knowledge, nature-based solutions are all integrated into how the decisions are made in terms of the climate change projects and decisions, which all these, as we can see, are part of the locally led adaptation principles. Finally, let me talk about collaborative actions, because the mechanism provides opportunity for other sectors to play, not just the government and the community, the private sector, international players. It is open for everyone to contribute to addressing climate change impacts at the community level, at the local level. This is because of the magnitude of climate change impacts and the expectation that climate change, unless addressed, is likely to have greater impacts in the future. And therefore, the broader, the multi-stakeholder collaboration that is in place, the more the resilience will be built, not only in the community, but also in the country as a whole. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much, Pauline, and we'll certainly touch upon the perspective of some of those diverse stakeholders, particularly small businesses, etc., when we get to Lwandle and speaking about IDC's approach to supporting the resilience of small businesses, not just with regards to climate change, but also other shocks and stresses that they may be experiencing. So Lwandle, just giving you a bookmark in your mind when we eventually get to you to touch upon that as well. But Pauline, incredibly interesting interesting to hear this process that the Kenyan government has gone through. And for those who are not familiar with Kenya's approach, this really was something that was developed out over many years, piloted. There was a harmonization with national policy, so the National Public Funds Management Act, all the way down to harmonization with subnational policy. As Pauline has pointed out, 2 to 3% from counties' budget goes into their county climate change fund, and all the ramifications of the harmonization of that policy from national to subnational. So, Pauline, we can certainly unpack that in a bit more detail as we hear from others. Basani, I think given Pauline's conversation or intervention rather about empowering communities, transparency, sense of ownership, and I'd mentioned earlier in my remarks that you co-authored this toolkit on advocating for rights-based climate investment plans in developing nations to realize a just transition. I want to give you a moment to frame that toolkit from your institute's perspective, why it was important, to perhaps respond to some of what Paulina said from Kenya's perspective. I know you mentioned your institute also does some work in Kenya as well, so you may have some insight into that. But what are some of the key mechanisms or approaches through which a rights-based approach, apologies, that was Constance trying to call me on WhatsApp, I will respond to them in a minute, in which a rights-based approach can ensure that climate investments are not just addressing environmental and economic challenges, but are really there to uphold and protect human rights, particularly of marginalized communities. So over to you, Basani, just to give us some introductory remarks about this toolkit, the framing, and then again, what are some of these rights-based approaches that we can really adopt to protect human rights, particularly of marginalized communities? Over to you, Basani.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I mean, why did we start off with talking about human rights? I mean, how does this help us, right? I mean, human rights are intrinsic, right, to every individual society, regardless of gender, regardless of race, regardless of culture, regardless of geography, and also ethnicity, right? So human rights are basically fundamental to affirming a shared sense of humanity and preserving integrity and treating human life as sacred. So a rights-based approach is really a framework that is grounded in global human rights norms, standards, and law. And it aims to tackle inequalities and correct for discriminatory practices that hinder the advancement of human rights. And I will say that environmental protection and climate protection is part of what we would consider a human right, because it's so fundamental to our existence, right? So while human rights, so I mean, as I say, they are intrinsic, right? So they are intrinsic beyond any kind of legal instruments. But we know that domestic and international law play a crucial role in actively realizing human rights and preventing and addressing human rights violation. So there's this very important then relationship between that is inscribed in human rights law, which is between the state, who are the duty bearers, and the people, who are the rights holders. And the state is required to ensure that human rights are respected and protected and fulfilled. So our rights-based climate finance approach contributes, we think, to the advancement of advancing fair and just climate financing regimes by drawing on three main human rights international agreements and guidelines that countries all over the world have signed up to, ratified, including South Africa, right? So first is the International Bill of Rights, which encapsulates the principles that guide financing rights realization. And some of them are also enshrined into our constitution. Secondly is the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change and the Paris Agreement that provide internationally agreed upon standards for climate action more broadly and climate financing in particular. And then we also have the guiding principles on foreign debt and human rights, which guides the terms and conditions of foreign debt in alignment with rights realization. So we chose these, we draw on these international agreements on the basis of that. We know that much of the climate finance is actually international in nature, right? So there's some kind of relationship between global north and global south that the kind of climate financing that countries are trying to attract. Therefore, these laws and guidelines should be activated to guide the manner in which financing for development and climate action is mobilized across countries. However, we know that there is a gap between the principles that are espoused within these agreements and the actual practice by states, right? Therefore, we do not argue that this rights-based approach alone will actually guarantee a more equitable and resilient economies and livelihoods. However, what we are trying to do is to say to civil society, trade unions, the public, that these are the rights that you have as the people, that can actually be claimed against states. And here are some of the tools and campaigns that we can wage to ensure that these rights are in fact realized. So, I mean, the toolkit, what it does is that they are, so having read a lot of these international agreements, right? We have, the toolkit has 5 clusters. Basically around, you know, cluster 1 is on national responsibilities. What responsibilities do states have, right? They have the responsibility to ensure that whatever financing we have that is mobilized is aligned with climate goals, right? They have the responsibility to ensure that we are maximizing that the principle of maximum amount of available resources is what is being mobilized, right? So we then engage, okay, what are the tools that can ensure that this happens? So, because these are the principles that are in these agreements, but then we kind of think about what are the tools that should be engaged in order to realize that principle. There's another principle on minimum core obligation of essential rights, meaning that the state has the obligation to ensure that, you know, basic needs are actually met. The right to water, clean energy, that kind of thing, that those needs, both environmental and social, are actually met. So we think about, okay, what kind of tools in terms of campaigns should we be mobilizing to ensure that that happens? And then there are also another cluster around obligations to others. They, as I said, there is this relationship between the global north and global south, and the UNFCCC basically says, and Paris Agreement, that there are certain things that the global north needs to do in support of the global south, right? And one area is around ensuring that financing is constituted in a way that ensures that technological development and transfer can take place. So we kind of look at what is happening within that terrain and think about tools and campaigns that are necessary to ensure that this happens, because we know that there are challenges, particularly within the WTO system, that prevents that kind of transfer from taking place. And then there are issues around, you know, responsibilities. What are the responsibility? Another cluster is around the responsibility of financial investments, right? There's the principle around ensuring that, you know, financing is new and additional. Okay, so we are not using money that has been allocated for, let's say, developmental needs, and now are repackaging that for climate finance. We don't want to, and this goes against the principle of ensuring that whatever financing is put is not regressive, in the sense that we're taking from another to put in another, right? We need to ensure that financing is new and additional. And we talk to tools that can support in that, and also that they are agreed full incremental costs. So whatever financing numbers we are talking to, these are well costed and are on the basis of meeting, climate and just transition needs. So basically, we are taking from these international agreements and creating these clusters, and then thinking about, okay, what are the kinds of actions that can be taken by civil society to ensure that they are part of the conversation and making sure that these are actually realized. Thanks, in a nutshell.
Great, thanks so much, Basani, and certainly a lot to try and distill down into a succinct answer. So thank you very much for doing that. I think really highlights that when we go from just adopting a framing of just transitions to actually operationalizing just transitions, that there are so many different dimensions that we need to consider, but actually in considering them, again, operationalizing action on those dimensions, again, requires tools, frameworks, approaches that can be put into practice, and we can bring to fruition the intention behind just transitions. I see Constance has joined us, but I want to jump to Lwandle first before I come back to Constance. Lwandle, again, on this conversation of operationalizing just transitions, of course, IDC plays such a valuable role in South Africa. Of course, you're working across a range of different industries, including agro-processing, transport, energy, also providing crisis funding for supporting businesses to rebound when they experience shocks and stresses. Lwandle, how has the framing of just transitions been integrated into the work of the IDC? Over to you.
Great, thank you. I'm glad that Basani came before me, because she actually explained the complexities that we are facing. So all of the challenges and the opportunities she's referred to, we've had to grapple with that, and we're still learning it. It's still a big challenge for us. So in trying to respond to this complexity that Basani has articulated well, I think it's early, now I'm saying early, it's just 2020, we had to look at our strategic orientation so that we could respond to all these new complexities that we're facing. So how we've approached it from a strategic point of view, we've had to review our value chain strategies, and we have a dedicated unit within the IDC, which is basically looking at developing these value chain strategies. And they grapple with all of these things that Basani has referred to. What does it mean for industries' competitiveness, as an example, in the context of climate change? What would that mean for the exports? What are the regulations, upcoming regulations that will basically have an impact on the various sectors, industries, and basically the value chains in which we're operating in? We also have a dedicated project development team, which basically look at these, strategies and come early on and basically formulate partnerships on the ground with various industries and say, if this is where these industries are going, what kind of project development do we mean? And what kind of, how do we basically go out there and develop a pipeline of new industries and new value chains? You would know we heavily involved in trying to actually establish, value chains or industries around green hydrogen, new energy vehicles, and even in existing industries within the steel sector and so forth. So we've got a dedicated team which looks at that, looks at project development, and in practical terms, they take you from pre-feasibility to feasibility, and we basically go through that processes with our business partners. We still have our dedicated business development teams, which go to the economy and actually identify these opportunities. And we've got business development managers who do that. There's another part of the organization where we actually look at dedicated partner, which we refer to as dedicated partnership programs. And there we manage a range of funds. At the moment, I think we're sitting on 39 social funds and what we refer to as social funds and solidarity funds. And we basically manage funds either on behalf of the government. You may be aware of the Social Employment Fund that we manage on behalf of the government. We've got a range of funds, innovation funds, funds dedicated to women and youth. And all these funds, if you look at a commonality, there's a common thread across them. They are there to look at how we transform and transition economy, but be very specific on what we want to leverage. Take, for example, the township economy. That fund, Township Economy Fund, it looks at what industries can be developed within the townships and what skills will be required. For example, what skills will be required? How do we continuously develop entrepreneurs at a township context? And of course, we still continue making. Should I?
Apologies, Constance. I see they've muted themselves. Please go ahead, Lawanda.
Okay. And then there's basically investments. So that we continuously making there. We actually have those deal making capabilities within our strategic business units. But then once our business partners are with us, we continuously developing what we call value creation plans for business partners, where you would be our client or our business partner. But whilst you're with us, we continuously looking at new opportunities, new challenges that you are facing, and actually hand-holding you in how we can actually navigate that space. What supports these capabilities that I've just explained to you? We've launched, I think, at COP28, our sustainable industrial, what we refer to as sustainable industrial pathways. It's basically our investment strategies where we actually look at pathways which are going to enhance the capabilities that I've referred to. So we basically came up with 4 pathways. And if you were to ask us, what is your strategic view and how do you ensure that from a strategic point of view, you take all of these complexities and you leverage the capabilities that you have in-house? So one of the pathways that we've said we're going to focus on is the IDC, is what we refer to as catalyzing low carbon and green growth. And there, basically, we look at how we, we transition from, your carbon-intensive sectors. We've looked at alternative fuel provisions. We've looked at, we look at transitioning existing industrial production, be either upstream or downstream. We've looked at how we're going to grow new industries, green industries. Those are new industries. And we've also focused at enablers for decarbonization. And there we've also looked at e-mobility. And there's a big component of that work that I've just explained in that pathway. Localization is it's at the core of what we want to do around catalyzing low carbon growth and green growth. Second pathway that we are focusing on is on how do we promote diversification and job-rich industrialization where we are, intervening in the economy. There, we've actually looked at high-value services and where we look at what are those enabling activities which are going to assist us absorb as many low-absorbing opportunities in the economy. So from a strategic point of view, that's a pathway that we're focusing on. Also there, we look at medium and high technology production. We also look at how do we assist or intervene in the carbon-intensive sector so that they get to a point where their emissions, if you want to focus on mitigation. But as part of that mitigation, we also look at adaptation opportunities that could be realized, for example, in the agricultural value chain. There's also productivity improvements that that are becoming very prominent in the work that we're doing. I know South Africa for the longest time, they've been looking at energy efficiency opportunities, water efficiency opportunities, but for industries, we've realized that a space that we still want to prioritize as part of this pathway. And of course, the circular economy, that's where issues around circular economy opportunities come in. So that's the second pathway. The third pathway is basically dedicated to the resilience of the economy and physical climate risk. So we've got a dedicated pathway where we're looking at leveraging the capabilities that we have and, you know, the industries that we're involved in, and actually try and understand what resilience will be required by these industries. And there it's about looking at existing strategic industrial capacity. It's also looking at the industrial risk that we're facing. It also looking at innovation and technology adoption that will be required by the industries that we're involved in. And the last pathway, that's where we look at regional value chains, where we look at higher value addition, intracontinental trade issues, your regional production linkages, your value added participation by Africa as a whole in the global value chains. And what enables this four pathways is your sustainable industrial infrastructure and energy. So we see infrastructure development and energy security as key enablers into us realizing the pathways that I focused on. And of course, another enabler is our ecosystem approach, where we're trying and optimize competitiveness and linkages and inclusion. So in a nutshell, from a strategic point of view, that's how it's those four pathways which drive our work. Your question would be, I hear this is from a strategic point of view, how are you doing? So how are you then taking this to the transactions or the investments that you are making on the ground? For anyone who approaches us as the IDC, we have what we call a development scorecard, and in this development scorecard, we've got what we call indicators and matrices, which basically define all these issues that we've been discussing. Take, for example, the just transition. So we see the just transition as part of, it's grouped together with indicators which focus on the productive economy. And for example, in the just transition, we've prioritized all those investments that we will need to make for renewables, battery storage, energy efficiency that I've touched on. We've looked at how we can continuously uphold labor and child labor principles within the energy, extractives, and agricultural sectors in the context of the just transition. We're looking at renewable energy promotion, where we're trying to link it with the hydrogen economy and new energy vehicles. We're looking at issues around social and economic inclusion. We're looking at reskilling and training capacitation. And we look at sustainable livelihood and promotion of local supply development. We look at mineral beneficiation of critical minerals. And I need to mention critical minerals, and that's a topic on its own, but I'm not going to dwell on it. And of course, the last metric that we focus on is around adaptation. And the reason why we have basically identified those matrix as defining the just transition for the IDs is because we didn't want to miss out on those business partners who are prioritizing this. And the question would be, so once we've identified those business partners or transactions which prioritize it, how do you ensure that they actually access the dedicated sustainable finance that we see in the market? So in basically scoring and in basically ensuring that we get those transactions, the sustainable finance then goes into that. So that was my last point. Thanks.
No, great. Thank you so much. And apologies to cut you off. I know there's so much more that we could continue to unpack in this conversation. We do have just a minute left, basically. So I'll just say a few wrap-up remarks. The hour really does fly by. Luanla, I think your interventions really help draw attention to these three aspects of just transitions, which is ensuring prosperity for all, reducing greenhouse gas emissions or avoiding greenhouse gas emissions, and building resilience. And I think Bisani unpacking the different elements of the toolkit and how we operationalize that. Luanda, I think you really tied that together in very practical terms from IDC's perspective. And Pauline, of course, you gave us a walkthrough of how Kenya, from national to subnational to local level, is devolving climate finance to put it into the hands of communities and to really realize some of these human rights-based approaches that create an enabling environment for the most climate-affected communities to take action. Colleagues, we are out of time, and unfortunately, we won't get a chance to hear from Constance. But again, in the send out of these recordings, etc., we will include Constance's story that was written up under the Global Center for Adaptation Stories of Resilience. And so you can still find out more information there. Thank you, everyone, very much for joining us. And please do continue to engage with the virtual summit. And I look forward to seeing you all at the closing session later on today. Thank you very much, everyone. And thank you very much to our wonderful speakers and for everyone who has joined. Thanks.